I was Captain James Mitchell, United States Army Air Forces, flying P-47 Thunderbolts with the 56 Fighter Group out of Boxstead, England, and I'm here to tell you why the P-47 was actually the best fighter America had in World War II, not the P-51 Mustang that everyone remembers, not the nimble P-38 Lightning, but the big, heavy, brutal Thunderbolt that could take punishment that would destroy any other aircraft and still bring you home. And I flew 127 combat missions over Europe between March 1943 and May 1945, and I saw P-51 shot down by single-cannon shells. I saw P-38s catch fire from hits that a Thunderbolt would shrug off, and I came back from missions with holes in my aircraft big enough to stick my fist through, with hydraulic lines cut and fuel tanks punctured and control surfaces shredded, and that massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine just kept running. Kept pulling me back across the channel to England, and the P-47 saved my life so many times that I came to love that aircraft with an intensity that other pilots might not understand, because when you're alone at 25,000 feet over Germany with flak bursting around you and Messerschmitts diving on your tail, you want an aircraft that's built like a tank, not a sports car, and the Thunderbolt was exactly that. 7 tons of radial engine and armor plate, and 8.50 caliber machine guns that could tear apart anything they hit. The first time I saw a P-47 was in January 1943 at Bradley Field in Connecticut during my fighter transition training, and I thought it was the ugliest aircraft I'd ever seen, massive and ungainly with that huge nose housing the R2800 double Wasp engine, sitting high off the ground on its long landing gear, looking more like a barrel with wings than a fighter aircraft. And the other pilots in my training class were disappointed because we'd been hoping for P-38s or P-51s, something sleek and beautiful, but our instructor was a combat veteran named Captain Robert Johnson who had flown P-47s in the Pacific, and he told us something I never forgot. He said, "A beautiful aircraft might make you feel good, but an ugly, tough aircraft will keep you alive." And he was right, because the P-47's design prioritized survivability over aesthetics. Every decision Republic Aviation made was about keeping the pilot alive, from the massive radial engine that could absorb bullets without stopping, to the armor plate behind the pilot's seat that was nearly half an inch thick, to the self-sealing fuel tanks that could take multiple hits without exploding, and all of this came at a cost in weight and agility. But it meant that P-47 pilots had the highest survival rate of any American fighter in Europe, and that's a statistic that matters more than speed or maneuverability when you're the one sitting in the cockpit. Captain Johnson spent several days teaching us the P-47's systems and capabilities, and the more I learned about the aircraft the more I appreciated its design, because everything about it reflected careful engineering focused on combat survivability rather than performance maximization. And he showed us the gun bays where 8.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns were mounted in the wings. 4 guns per wing, with 425 rounds per gun for the inboard guns and 267 rounds per gun for the outboard guns, giving us about 3,400 rounds total, which translated to about 25 seconds of sustained fire, and those 8 guns firing simultaneously produced an incredible rate of fire, about 100 rounds per second. And Johnson said that a 2-second burst from all 8 guns was usually enough to destroy any German fighter if you hit it properly. And I practiced shooting at towed targets and got comfortable with the gun's sight and the sound of all 8 guns firing, that distinctive ripping sound that became familiar and reassuring, and I learned to lead targets properly and to fire in short bursts to conserve ammunition, and by the time we finished training I felt confident in the aircraft even though I still thought it was ugly. Because I'd learned that beauty is irrelevant when your life depends on your aircraft's ability to absorb damage and keep flying. I arrived in England in March 1943 and joined the 56 Fighter Group, which was one of the first P-47 units to see combat in Europe, and our first missions were fighter sweeps over France and the Low Countries, trying to draw up German fighters, and I was nervous because the P-47 had a reputation for being a poor dogfighter. Too heavy and too big to turn with German FW-190s or Bf-109s, but Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, our group commander, taught us tactics that played to the Thunderbolt's strengths, and he explained that the P-47 was faster in a dive than any German fighter, that it could absorb battle damage better than anything the Germans flew, that it had better high-altitude performance because of its turbocharged engine, and that those 8.50 caliber machine guns, when you got them on target, could destroy an enemy aircraft in a 2-second burst. And he told us to fight vertically instead of horizontally, to use boom and zoom tactics where we dove on German fighters. From altitude, took our shots, and then used our speed to climb back up to safety, and this approach worked brilliantly, because the P-47 excelled at vertical combat. It could dive at speeds approaching 550 miles per hour without breaking apart, something no German fighter could match, and it could climb back to altitude faster than they expected. And within a few months the 56th Fighter Group became one of the top-scoring fighter groups in the 8th Air Force, not despite flying P-47s but because of it. My first aerial victory was on April 15, 1943, during an escort mission for B-17s attacking the Focke-Wulf factory at Bremen, and I was flying as wingman to Captain Jerry Johnson when we spotted a formation of FW-190s climbing to attack the bombers from below, and Jerry called the bounce, and we rolled into a dive from 28,000 feet. And I watched my airspeed indicator climb past 450 miles per hour as we plummeted down toward those FW-190s, the whole aircraft vibrating and roaring as we dove. And I picked out one German fighter and got him in my gun sight and pressed the trigger, and all 8 guns opened up simultaneously with a sound like ripping canvas magnified 100 times, and I saw my tracers converging on the FW-190's fuselage, pieces flying off as the .50 caliber rounds tore through aluminum and steel. And then his right wing folded up and he went into a spin trailing smoke and flame, and I pulled out of my dive at 18,000 feet, the G-forces pressing me down into my seat. And I climbed back to altitude while the FW-190 fell away below me, and Jerry's voice came over the radio saying, "Good kill, Mitchell, now get back up here before his friends arrive." And that was my introduction to P-47 combat tactics, diving from altitude with speed and altitude advantage, taking your shot, and getting back to safety before the enemy could respond, using the Thunderbolt's strengths rather than trying to dogfight where it was disadvantaged. The P-47's ruggedness became legendary, and I saw examples of it constantly, aircraft returning to base with battle damage that should have been fatal, and I remember in June 1943, Lieutenant Fred Christensen came back from a mission over the Ruhr with 17 holes in his aircraft from German cannon fire. One shell had gone through his right wing and taken out 6 feet of leading edge. Another had hit his engine cowling and shattered 2 cylinders on the R2800 engine, and that magnificent radial engine just kept running on the remaining 16 cylinders, and Fred flew that damaged Thunderbolt for 200 miles back to England and landed it safely. And when we examined the damage, the crew chief just shook his head and said that any inline engine would have been destroyed by that hit. But the R2800's radial configuration meant that it could lose several cylinders and still produce enough power to fly, and this wasn't an isolated incident, it happened again and again. Pilots coming back with 1 or 2 or 3 cylinders shot out, and the engine just compensated, kept running, got them home. I had my own experience with the P-47's toughness on August 17, 1943, during the raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, which was one of the bloodiest days in 8th Air Force history, and we were escorting B-17s deep into Germany, pushing the P-47's range to the absolute limit, and we got bounced by a large formation of Bf-109s over Bavaria. And I got into a turning fight with one 109 that was more aggressive than I was, and he got on my tail and opened fire, and I felt the impacts as his cannon shells hit my aircraft, a sound like someone hitting the fuselage with sledgehammers, and I broke hard left and pushed the throttle to full power and dove for the deck, and I could feel that something was wrong. The controls were sluggish and there was a vibration I hadn't felt before, but the engine was still running strong and the aircraft was still responding. And I made it back to England flying at 2,000 feet because I didn't trust the aircraft to hold together at higher altitude. And when I landed and got out to inspect the damage, I found that a 20mm cannon shell had hit the armor plate directly behind my seat, and the armor had stopped the shell, but the impact had been so violent that it had bent the seat frame and cracked 3 longerons in the fuselage, and another shell had gone through my left wing and severed the aileron control cable. And I'd been flying on the backup cable without even knowing it, and the crew chief told me that in any other fighter I'd be dead. The shell would have gone through the seat and through me, but the P-47's armor protection was so extensive that it had saved my life, and I bought that crew chief a bottle of whiskey and told him to take good care of my aircraft because I owed my life to Republic Aviation's engineers who had decided that pilot protection was more important than saving weight. The transition to escort missions deep into Germany in late 1943 and early 1944 showcased the P-47's capabilities even more, because we started carrying 150-gallon external fuel tanks under our bellies, and later 108-gallon tanks under each wing, and this gave us the range to escort bombers all the way to targets like Berlin and Munich and Vienna. And people forget that P-47s were escorting bombers to Berlin before P-51s arrived in theater in large numbers, and the Thunderbolt could carry these heavy external tanks and still fight effectively, while some other fighters became sluggish and vulnerable with full external tanks attached. And I remember escorting bombers to Brunswick on January 11, 1944, in the middle of winter, with temperatures at altitude around 50 degrees below zero, and my canopy frosted over partially despite the defroster. And we flew for 3 hours at 27,000 feet, and when we finally spotted German fighters and I dropped my external tanks to engage, the P-47 responded instantly, transforming from a long-range escort into a deadly fighter in seconds, and we shot down 4 Bf-109s in that engagement without losing a single aircraft. And I thought about how the P-47's design allowed it to excel at multiple roles simultaneously. It could be a long-range escort with external tanks, a high-altitude interceptor, a low-altitude fighter-bomber. All because of its rugged construction and powerful engine and flexible design. The ground attack missions in 1944 and 1945 proved the P-47's versatility in ways that the P-51 could never match, because the Thunderbolt could carry an enormous ordnance load, up to 2,500 pounds of bombs or 10 5-inch rockets, and it could absorb ground fire better than any other fighter, and starting in late 1943 we began flying fighter-bomber missions, hitting German transportation networks and supply depots and tank columns, and this was dangerous work because you had to come in low and slow to hit ground targets accurately, and German anti-aircraft fire at low altitude was devastating, and I saw P-51s and P-38s shot down by single hits from German 20mm flak guns, but the P-47 could take multiple hits and keep flying, and I remember a mission on June 24, 1944, shortly after D-Day, when we were hitting German armor trying to reach the Normandy beaches, and I dove on a column of German tanks near Villers-Bocage and fired my rockets and pulled up through a curtain of flak, and I felt impacts all along my fuselage and wings, and when I got back to our airstrip in France the ground crew counted 47 holes in my aircraft, including several that had hit the engine, and 1 flak shell had gone through my right wing and cut the main fuel line, and I'd been flying on the left wing tank only for the last hour without realizing it, and the aircraft was repaired overnight, and I flew it again the next morning. And this was typical of P-47 operations, taking damage that would ground other aircraft permanently, getting patched up, and flying again the next day, because the Thunderbolt was designed for the brutal reality of combat, not for peacetime performance demonstrations. The statistics tell the story of the P-47's effectiveness better than any anecdotes, because P-47s flew more combat missions in the European theater than any other American fighter, more than 546,000 combat sorties. They destroyed more than 7,000 enemy aircraft, with about 3,700 destroyed in air-to-air combat and another 3,200 destroyed on the ground during strafing attacks. They destroyed or damaged more than 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. And they did this with a loss rate lower than the P-51 or P-38, because the P-47's ruggedness meant that pilots survived hits that would have killed them in other aircraft, and when you factor in pilot survival, which is what really matters in a long war, the P-47 was clearly superior, because a dead pilot can't fly missions or train new pilots or use his experience to improve tactics. But a pilot who survives because his aircraft absorbed battle damage can go on to fly another 100 missions and become an ace and teach others what he's learned, and the P-47 brought pilots home, mission after mission, taking punishment and keeping them alive, and that made it the best fighter America had, not in terms of speed or range or maneuverability in isolation, but in terms of overall combat effectiveness when you account for survivability and versatility, and the ability to perform multiple roles. I flew my last combat mission on May 7, 1945, the day before Germany surrendered, an armed reconnaissance mission over southern Germany looking for any last-ditch German forces, and I was flying the same P-47 I'd flown since September 1944, tail number 226473, which I'd named Survivor, because that's what it did. It survived, and I survived in it. And I brought that aircraft back to England after V-Day, and I stood next to it, and ran my hand along its battered fuselage, and thought about all the missions we'd flown together, 127 combat missions over 2 years, from fighter sweeps over France to bomber escorts to Berlin to ground attack missions in the final days of the war. And that aircraft had holes that had been patched and repaired so many times that parts of the fuselage looked like patchwork quilts, and I thought about how many times it had saved my life. How many hits it had taken that would have killed me in a different aircraft, and I knew that I owed my survival to the P-47's designers who had prioritized toughness and survivability over every other consideration, who had built an aircraft that wasn't the fastest or the prettiest but was the most likely to bring you home, and that's what matters in war, coming home, surviving to see your family again, and the P-47 Thunderbolt did that better than any other fighter in the American inventory. The P-51 Mustang got more attention and more glory, partly because it looked so beautiful with its sleek lines and bubble canopy, partly because it had longer range and could escort bombers all the way to target and back without refueling, and partly because of excellent public relations by North American Aviation, but the pilots who flew both aircraft, and I flew P-51s during training, would tell you that the Thunderbolt was the aircraft they'd choose if they had to fly into heavy combat. Because the P-51 was fragile by comparison, its liquid-cooled Merlin engine would quit if you took a single hit to the cooling system, while the P-47's air-cooled radial engine could lose multiple cylinders and keep running, and the P-51 had less armor and thinner skin and couldn't carry as much ordnance for ground attack, and while the P-51 was faster and had better range and was more maneuverable, none of that mattered if you got shot down, and P-47 pilots had better survival rates. And that's not just my opinion, that's statistical fact, and I knew dozens of pilots who were alive in 1945 because they flew P-47s, who would have died if they'd been flying different aircraft, and that included me. I would have died at least 3 times during my combat tour if I'd been flying a P-51 instead of a P-47. Because I took hits that would have destroyed a P-51's cooling system or structural integrity. But the Thunderbolt just absorbed the damage and kept flying, and I made it home, and I got to see my wife and my daughter again, and I got to have the life I dreamed about during those long missions over Germany, and I owed that life to the P-47. The decision about which fighter was best often came down to mission requirements and personal priorities, and for pure air-to-air combat at high altitude, the P-51 had advantages in terms of maneuverability and rate of climb. And for very long-range escort missions the P-51's efficiency meant it could go farther on less fuel. But for the kind of all-around fighter-bomber work that became increasingly important in 1944 and 1945, the P-47 was superior, and the ground troops who we supported with close air support missions would tell you they preferred having P-47s overhead because we could carry more bombs and rockets, we could absorb more ground fire and keep attacking, and we could stay in the target area longer providing continuous support. And I remember talking to an infantry captain in France in July 1944 who said that P-47s had saved his company during a German counterattack. That we'd stayed over the battlefield for 40 minutes making repeated bombing and strafing runs, despite heavy flak, and that kind of sustained ground attack simply wasn't possible with P-51s, which were optimized for high-altitude air combat rather than low-altitude ground attack, and as the war progressed and air superiority was established, ground attack became more important than dogfighting, and the P-47 excelled in this role while the P-51 was adequate but not ideal. And this is reflected in the kill statistics where P-47s destroyed far more ground targets than P-51s did, and those ground kills, those destroyed tanks and trucks and trains, probably had more impact on the war's outcome than the aerial victories that get more attention in popular histories. After the war I stayed in the Air Force and transitioned to jets, flew F-80 Shooting Stars and later F-86 Sabres in Korea, and the jets were faster and more modern, but I never flew another aircraft that felt as indestructible as the P-47, because jet engines were delicate and couldn't take battle damage the way that massive R-2800 radial engine could. And I found myself missing the Thunderbolt during combat missions over North Korea, missing that feeling of security that came from flying an aircraft that was built like a tank, and I survived Korea too, flew 93 combat missions and came home in one piece, and I retired from the Air Force in 1965 as a full colonel with more than 4,000 hours of fighter time, and I spent my retirement years going to air shows and aviation museums and giving talks about the P-47, trying to educate people about how good that aircraft really was. Trying to correct the historical record that gave all the credit to the P-51, and I would tell audiences that the P-47 Thunderbolt was the most underrated fighter of World War II, that it deserved recognition as the best all-around fighter America produced, not because it was perfect, but because it prioritized the things that mattered most in combat: survivability and versatility, and the ability to complete the mission and bring the pilot home. And those are the metrics by which we should judge military aircraft, not speed records or aesthetic appeal, but whether they accomplish their mission and protect their pilots, and by those standards the P-47 Thunderbolt was simply the best, and I was proud to have flown it in combat, proud to have survived because of its ruggedness, and grateful to the engineers and designers and factory workers who built 15,686 of those magnificent aircraft and gave me and thousands of other pilots the chance to come home from war. The Korean War experience reinforced my appreciation for the P-47's design philosophy because I saw F-80 jets shot down by small arms fire that wouldn't have phased a Thunderbolt, watched pilots killed when their jet engines flamed out from battle damage, and while the F-86 Sabre was a superb aircraft for its time, faster and more agile than anything the North Koreans or Chinese flew, it still couldn't absorb punishment the way a P-47 could. And I had several close calls in Korea where I took hits that damaged my aircraft but not fatally, and I'd limp back to base wondering if the same hits would have been even less significant in a P-47, and I concluded that the transition from propeller-driven fighters to jets had involved trade-offs, gaining speed and altitude performance but losing some of the ruggedness and damage tolerance that had made aircraft like the P-47 so survivable. And this became a recurring theme in military aviation: the tension between performance and survivability. Between building aircraft that could fly faster and higher versus building aircraft that could take hits and keep flying, and I believed then and believe now that survivability should be prioritized, that an aircraft that keeps its pilot alive is worth more than an aircraft that sets speed records, and I advocated for this perspective during my later career when I was involved in aircraft evaluation and procurement decisions, always pushing for designs that emphasized pilot protection and damage tolerance, always asking, "Will this aircraft bring pilots home?" before asking, "Will it win dogfights?" And I like to think I had some influence on that debate, though military aviation has always been seduced by performance specifications and impressive statistics, and the lesson of the P-47, that the best fighter is the one you survive in, has had to be relearned in every generation.